Clapping ahead of time. That way I know I get some claps out of this. See if I can move this up a little ways without causing any harm. Get a little bit to the side. Oh, I got zits up there because I love the comics. I love zits. And zit was assigned, the boy was assigned a high school presentation. And the presentation was on write about a famous ancestor. And so his mom came up with the most famous ancestor in the family, who was the pencil sharpener. You think that through, you know what a old-time pencil sharpener was. He was the guy that went around and sharpened the pencil sharpeners. Now, having been a school teacher, I appreciate that, because there's nothing worse than having a dull pencil sharpener in your room that won't sharpen anything. Now, I always thought the only option was then to replace the thing. But apparently they used to have pencil sharpeners. And so he's not very thrilled with that. And he said, this is going to be the sorriest paper ever. And he gets his buddy over there, and the buddy says, you're doing the genealogy report? He says, yeah. And his buddy says, well, I'm a descendant of Mayan kings and stuff like that. And this says, I'm descended from the guy that sharpened the pencil sharpener. And Zitz finally says, my family tree has root rot. The whole point of that was that last little line. My tree has some root rot in it, I discovered. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. First thing, that tree I have no connection to. I have no clue who those people are. I just thought it was a cool picture. And so I put it on there. We're going to talk a little bit about what do you mean my tree isn't accurate? Of course your tree is accurate. Well, is it? That's the question. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what my journey, and maybe through my journey it'll give you some ideas of what you can do. It all began with this, and it was kind of small. Those are kind of small and probably hard to see, but that's okay because there isn't much there. Those were notes of the sources found on some of the documentation that I inherited from my grandmother. My grandmother started back in the 1930s, maybe even in the late 20s, doing research. 1920s, not the 2020s. And doing sources was a little different in those days. That one says personal records. That's a lot of help. Well, it's not much better over here. This is information from the Wilkins line on chart number 1. Well, what's chart number 1? I have no idea. And over here, it's talking about a manuscript that was dictated to a Miles Johnson by John G. Wilkins. That would be my third great grandfather. Well, where's the manuscript? You know, it's not anywhere to be found. Or over here, there's all kinds of things, including people that this came from. Of course, that note's now 75 years old. So the odds are everybody on that thing's dead anyway, so there'd be no way to follow up. I reached the point where I realized, I've got a quarter of my ancestry that my grandmother did, which is beautifully laid out, complete, going back into the 1600s. But then I started running into a few little snags along the way. And that made me worry, because this is all I had to fall back on was stuff like that, which was worthless. I'd always just kind of left it because, hey, it was well researched back in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, so it must be good. That was what I was laboring under. So, I had some tough questions to face. This is my grandmother's pedigree. Actually, it's half of her pedigree. And so one of the questions was, when was this developed, and when was the last time you seriously reviewed what's there? Well, I had never seriously reviewed the whole thing. I had taken it on face value. Okay, has this tree stood the test of time? Well, that's what was getting me worried, because there was this little spot that was a problem, and that one over there, and this one down here. There were starting to be some issues coming up. And then, of course, it was it you or somebody else who developed the tree? But now, that's a trick question, because, of course, we always do it right? I've made a few mistakes. So, you know, that one really is a non-question. Doesn't matter whether you did it or your grandmother did it, it can be wrong. And then are there sources to really back up what's there? And that's what I wanted to do, was to do something to verify what was in my tree, supposed tree. To do this, you kind of have to understand a little bit about history. Now, I see some young people here. You're young compared to me, by all means. And some of you are not old times researchers. You may have only gotten started 10 years ago, even maybe 20 years ago. And the world was a lot different 100 years ago. So if we kind of do a little timeline and look at the differences, back in 1920, about all you could do was write letters to people or spend money and travel to an archive or a genealogy library somewhere or to some relative's house. And that's about all you could do. There were very few books. There were no computers. There was no microfilm. There was no digital stuff. It was a tough road to hoe to get anything. It took a long time. What we can do today in a day could be a year's work in 1920. We don't appreciate how nice we have it. Okay, by the 70s, we found that there's a lot more records available. And they were in published form. A lot of books were coming out, magazines, things like that. And even microfilm was beginning to become popular. Microfilming started in the late 1950s, very first microfilms, which have been turned now into digital images. And then we come to last year. I didn't update this. I should have made that 23. And of course, we now have computer technology, digitization. We have a lot more things available. Of course, realize the digital stuff isn't everything. And I realize that. But hey, come on. We're sitting here in the San Joaquin Valley. And so to get access to what's in Boston is a fairly expensive airplane flight or a long drive. And so we really do kind of rely, being out here in the hinterland, if you want to call it that, on what we can find online. And so we're going to focus mainly on what's available online because, quite frankly, that's where most of the stuff we find is found. Okay, so to answer the question, how accurate is my pedigree, I set in my mind 3 basic plans of attack. The first thing was to gather all the sources I could. Okay, finding them wherever I could find them, get sources. The second one was to gather facts, not just birth, marriage, and death, but all the other facts I could find on the person. You know, it could be court records, it could be land records, any kind of facts about the people to start building a more complete person. My pedigree really was just a bunch of people's names. I don't know who these people were. And then the last one is, to me, the most important one, which is to find some biographical information. I wanted to learn about these people, find out what their life was like, what were their accomplishments, what did they do. And so these are the things I was after. Now remember, if you use the QR code from the presentation, you get all these slides. You won't really have to copy all this down. Just trying to save you some work up there. Okay? You don't really have to do that. So this was my plan of attack, what I wanted to do. So where would I start? Well, obviously, I'd find out what source and data I already have. Well, you saw that front page. This was pretty easy to do for a lot of people because there just wasn't anything there other than some obscure note that really didn't mean anything to me. Then I started looking for online sources, and I'd search everywhere online that I could to find sources. I'd go to print and digital books. Now realize, you don't need to have a library like over there on the wall nowadays. Anything that's printed prior to 1927 as of last week is in the what do you call it, the public domain. And you can have digital images of the books. I have 100 or more books in my collection sitting on this computer because I just download them. If they're in the public domain, I just download the book. I've got all kinds of room on here. I'll never fill up this hard drive, really. And so, you know, you can have a real book collection. You don't have to worry about it for those books that are in public domain. I go to reputable journals, the Register, the New York Biographical and Genealogical Magazine. There's one called TAG, the American Genealogist, which has become one of my favorites. It's one I didn't even know about till about 5 years ago. I'd also look for archival records. Sometimes a lot of archival places now are online newspapers, and even online trees. Yeah, I know, we've got this thing about trees being bad. There are some good trees out there. The ones that have the sources are the ones I want to look at, and then verify if the sources really belong to the people they say they do, because a lot of times even that's false. But it's another source to look at. So these are the things I would do to begin. Okay, now I needed a way to keep track of all this. I don't like paper. My wife and I, never the twain shall meet. She does not like computers. I don't like paper. So we do have this little friction in our marriage. But I've gone to try to be as much paperless as possible, which means digital. And so I needed a way to keep track of my stuff digitally. And so one of the two ways, my two main ways, is my Roots Magic program. I use Roots Magic. You can use any program you want, but I really recommend, if you're doing this on a regular basis, spend the $35 or so, buy a program and use it, because nobody can mess on your computer. That's the one place you don't have to worry if Ancestry folds next week for some reason, or, you know, whatever happens out there. If you've got it on your computer, you don't even need internet to look at it. Okay? And so what I did is, because I did this starting back when they first started doing computers, Path 2.1 or something like that. And I didn't follow the note doing, you know, the regular source thing, because it was so cumbersome. And so I started my sources in my notes, and it just became too big a deal to switch over. And so in my Path program, for the most part, my sources mostly are in my notes, which is bad, but that's just me. That's the way I do it. And I do have sources that are regular sources in Path also. Okay, the other side of it is the papers that I gathered, things I found. I needed a way to store them. And so I made a folder in my documents called Genealogy. Of course, all genealogists have a genealogy folder, right? Mm-hmm. And then in that folder, I made one called Archives. And in my archive folder, I made a subfolder for every surname in my tree. Literally every surname. So that I have a little folder for every surname. That's just a small portion of them. And I file everything over in the surname file based on whatever surname I'm working on. And then inside those folders, things happen differently. But the main thing is, I have these folders set up, and that's where I go to find all my stuff. There's only about 55,000 items in there, or something like that. I mean, it's really a gigantic collection. Okay. And individual folders have up to, from maybe one item in them, up to 5,500 in the largest folder, single surname folder. Okay, this is an example of one. It's called the Armistead family, Armistead Research. There's one item in there. That's all I've got. That's the minimum. If I have one thing, I'll make a folder for it. Here's another one for my Anno family, A-N-N-O. And in there I have some subfolders. I have a research log, cemetery records, census records, family group sheets, pedigrees, land records, another research log one for some reason, and then a couple of separate articles. So that's a little more extensive. And then this is the grandfather of all of my Carter family, which I've done most of my the most research on. This is the one that has 5,500 items in it. And the list actually goes on down here somewhere into the library. down below the screen. And so there's a lot of subfolders. I have a folder for each guy: Benjamin, John, Richard, and Jane McKinney, Richard 1, Richard 2 and 3. People in my pedigree, I have a folder for every generation where I have the things about that particular generation sorted out, in addition to all these other things. And of course, nobody would be able to make hide nor hair of this stuff, but I do because I know how it's organized. And that's okay, that's what it's for, is for you to be able to store stuff and find things. So that was my storage system. Works for me, might not work for you. Okay, so let's look at a family and see what I do. So in my family, I have a William Sheffield that married a Mary Webb. I'm not real thrilled with the documentation on the family, but I'm satisfied that it's okay. There is no marriage record for them, so that's an issue. But there's enough other documentation like birth records and things like that, a will and stuff that names the wife, so that I'm satisfied that Mary Webb was the wife of William Sheffield. So the real issue we're going to talk about is what goes on over here with Mary's parents, who I have listed as Christopher Webb and Humility Wheaton. Okay, and so I didn't have a thing on them. So I wanted to do my verification. And so the first thing I do is I try to look for sources. Since I didn't have any, where can I go? So I said, okay, let's try Family Search. Probably not the greatest place to go, but let's try that. And so I did, and he had a whole slew of sources. And what was real nice is the very first one was the marriage of Christopher Webb and Humility Wheaton in 1628 in Crediton, Devon, England, which is where they should have been from. And so that was great because that establishes they're a couple. Now the only question is, did that couple have my Mary Webb? Well, the reason I hadn't been able to find it before was found in here. Down here in the next to the last source is a baptism record for Mary Deb. Now if you go look at the original record, it looks like Webb, but the W's kind of messy, and the translator came out with Deb instead of Webb. But the parents are Christopher and Humility, and the birth is the right time frame, 2nd of July, 1637. So now I'm satisfied these are her parents. Okay, so I know I've got that just through sources. I didn't have to go any further. The question now becomes, what if I want to go to the next generation and find Christopher's parents? Okay, so I tried out some things. I looked at Find a Grave. I always worry about Find a Grave because sometimes it's helpful, sometimes it's misleading, sometimes it's just frankly bad. But it's there. And so I did find that he had a Find a Grave memorial. Obviously there's not going to be a picture because we're talking about a guy that died in 1671. The odds of a tombstone still being around since 1671 is pretty slim. It says it contains a biography, so that was helpful. So I said, okay, let's go take a look at this and see what we come up with. So this is the top part of his memorial, and it starts out by saying he was born on the 15th of April, 1599 in Stratford-upon-Avon. Now what do we know about that little location?
Shakespeare.
That's where Shakespeare came from. You'd be amazed how many of my relatives they try to claim came from Stratford-upon-Avon. That's like the holy grail of England. Have your family come from Shakespeare's town. Actually, see, there's Webbs that marry into the Shakespeare family. And this is what they're trying to do, is to qualify them to be part of the family of Shakespeare. That's what's up here, quite frankly. It was a strange memorial because it has an old ditto article. I was a school teacher back in the 60s. I know what ditto machines were. And those old crank out ditto copies that were blue that smelled so cool. Oh, I love the smell of those things. You almost get high on them. But there's a digital article that says this information, that he was born in 1599 Stratford upon Avon. So where did that come from? Now remember, he marries in Devonshire. Now Devonshire's down on the south coast of England, and Stratford upon Avon's way up here north of London, if I'm not wrong. And so we're talking two really diverse locations. So in that article that's up there, it shows, it says that he was born there, and it gives a source. And the source is called the Webb Family Tree. And crazy enough, that website is still there. That's my phone, Barb. Turn your phones off, folks. Don't disturb us. My son. Our son.
Yes.
Okay, so the Webb Family Tree was referenced, so I went and found the Webb Family Tree. You can't see it, but that's okay, because there's nothing there worth looking at anyway. It's a spreadsheet with 2 lines that says he was born on such and such a date. There's no sources. That's just a piece of garbage. I mean, there's your justification, this great source, which is nothing but a statement. Okay? And then finally, there were a whole bunch of references to a thing called Webb Genealogies from 1350. I could not find it. It says in here I couldn't find this, that it might be an unpublished manuscript. I actually did find it the other day. I hadn't had time to set this up. And it was an unpublished manuscript. It's in the collection at Family Search. And it's an old Minio article. And it has no sources whatsoever in it. And it's, you know, the famous story that 4 brothers came over, and one settled in Virginia, one settled in Connecticut, one settled in Massachusetts, and one settled who knows where, but they were all brothers because they had the same name. Well, that's the kind of story he's saying about the Webbs. That they all came from the guy that was the grandson of Shakespeare, or the grandson of the wife of Shakespeare, or something like that. The Webb family that's tied into Shakespeare, which nobody could prove. Okay, so we'll look at that. I couldn't really find anything to help on him. So I went over to humility, and it says that she was born in Stratford upon Avon, about 1599, no date. And it gives her death, and that comes from the Baintree, Massachusetts town records, so that's good. Okay, and her memorial's linked to her husband, and just has a short little note. There's not much found there. Doesn't really have a full birth date. And as I researched her, I started realizing there was a real problem because people were trying to make her into a Humility Cooper who happened to be on a little ship called the Mayflower. And so, you know, they're trying to claim Mayflower descendancy, but we know, because we've seen the marriage record, her last name's Wheaton. But there's a lot of people out there that say it's Cooper. And so it's good to do this kind of research because then you can start seeing what's really true, what's false, and all of that. Okay, so what next? I do my favorite, Google. And I just put in quotes, Humility Wheaton, Christopher Webb, and see what I come up with. And my first 3 sources right here were what I was hoping for. One of them is a website called WikiTree. It's one I strongly recommend that you find when you do searches because WikiTree tends to have great sources. It's a wiki, like the Family Search program, but each person's record is controlled by whoever created it. So there's not a lot of messing with records. It's hard to get things changed without going through the person that created the record. There's another one called Genie. Genie.com is another great wiki type tree. And then the third one on here was the Webb Genealogy, but we know about that website. We're not even going to go there, but those first 2 were pretty good. So I look at the first one, Genie, or the second one, Genie. I figured it wasn't going to be that good anyway, so I thought I'd go there first. I love this. What do you do when you don't know the parents for somebody? This person says she's the daughter of Humility Wheaton's father and Humility Wheaton's mother. Oh, that was wonderful. I love that. Now this drive, you have to have something to fill in the blank. That's the ultimate that I've ever seen. Okay, so this person pretty clueless when it comes to her parentage, at least. And they did have some information over here. Too small, I know, to see, but the bottom line of it was that most of the stuff that's there we already read. We know that she gets confused with Cooper. We know she married in Devonshire to Webb and that kind of stuff, so there's really nothing new there. So I said, okay, let's try, and there's nothing about a birth. So I said, okay, let's go over to WikiTree and see what that link had. At least there they say, father unknown, mother unknown. They're going to be honest about it. The thing that's nice about these sites is they don't tend to pack a lot of garbage into it. You know, go to some sites, they pack a lot of fake children and stuff like that. Usually it's the other way around. They're very conservative here. They might leave people out, but they're not going to put extras in. And so we can go with that. This was very interesting because up here in the biographical stuff, it gives a whole story about how they think they know who the parents are for her, because there's this little town just 2 miles from where she got married that has a Wheaton family. It's spelled a little bit different, but it's obviously Wheaton. And they have children that fall right into the right time period, except that she was born probably prior to 1604, and the town records were destroyed prior to 1604, so there's no baptism records for her, unfortunately. But that's where the family probably comes from. But they're nice enough not to fill it in because they really don't know, but they're providing you with some information. That's the one place on earth that I found information about her parentage, through doing this kind of a search. When they go through, they talk about her parents, her children, research notes talking extensively about how she couldn't be the gal from the Mayflower and how the dates don't work and all that kind of stuff. And then all these sources, and you can't see them very well, but there's all these hot links for the sources. That's why I like WikiTree. You don't just get sources, you usually get the link. And you can go right to that document and see it. So I really like to find stuff there. So this didn't bring me any real news. It gave me some leads, and it gave me some ways to get some more background information on her, which was good. Okay, so now I didn't have a folder on this family. I'd never worked on this family before. So I wanted to do something for humility. So what I do is I open up my Word program. You can use any document creator you want. I happen to have 365, so I open up Word, and then I just copy and paste the websites in there. I'll make a little thing that says, you know, Humility Wheaton, find a grave, and give the URL, and then I just copy the web page. And I go and I say Humility Wheaton, WikiTree, and then just copy the URL, and then just copy the web page. And just gather all that stuff. And then it becomes a big long old document. Who cares? It's electronic. You know, you're not worried about printing this out in paper, so you can even leave it the way it was on the page and have big old print and stuff like that. The point is, I want to gather all this stuff so I don't have to go looking again. And I always get the URL and tell who the person is that I'm looking for that's on that page and where it came from, and then the URL for it. And I paste all that together and create a document, and then I go over into my genealogy folder to my archives, and I create a Wheaton research, and I drop that article in there. And now I've got all the background information. I have the Genie page, I have the WikiTree page, I have the Find a Grave record, all that on a document now. And I don't have to go back looking for this stuff, it's all there. Copied and pasted into the article. Okay, and now that folder is over in my archives between Wheatley and White, because everything goes in alphabetical. And so the only bad part with that is trying to remember now, which line does Wheaton go to? That can always be a challenge for me. Then I go over into Path or Bruce Magic and pull up the surname and see where it fits in my tree that way. Okay, so let's try a different one. Elizabeth was the wife of John Nail. That was one of my dead ends for a long time. And after I resolved John Nail, the problem was, what was Elizabeth's last name? I did a lot of research on this family, did all those things you're supposed to do to find it out. And I tried everything I could think of. I looked at every document on the children. Now we're talking people born right before 1800 and died in the middle of the 1800s. So we're talking way back there. But I tried to find any reference to her last name. I ended up finding 11 children. And I also found nobody was researching this. I found one other person researching this family. And she had to do the same thing I did, put the family together. And we ended up with the same family. So we must have done it right because we both agreed with each other doing it independently. Okay, so I dug and dug trying to figure out what was Elizabeth's last name. And then this fourth child, Hannah, had a second marriage. And in her second marriage, it went and it, in 1900, it gave her parents' names, John Nail, and it looks like Elizabeth Ironbridge. I looked for Ironbridge for a year and finally gave up. That's just not a surname that exists. And so, I got frustrated. I went over into Ancestry and somebody said it was Throwbridge or Towbridge, T-O. Not T-R, but just T-O-W-B-R-I-D-G-E is another way to spell it. And if you compare the names, the N can look like a W in old cursive. The O's are the same. The R's are the same. And then the only real issue is the I and the T. Whether you could write an I that would look like a T or just make a sloppy I or make a sloppy T that looks like an I. But I started looking for Towbridge or Throwbridge. And sure enough, I found where they were from in what's now West Virginia, Hampshire County, Virginia. In those days, a will for a John Towbridge, where it names, sold several times in the will. This is classic. John Nail, my son-in-law, or my daughter Elizabeth, the wife of John Nail. Oh, sweet guy. Gotta thank this guy because he's fitting this family together for me, which was so sweet. And then, on top of that, I get a whole pedigree out of the deal, thanks to people over on Ancestry. Now the question is this thing accurate? Because that's always where we end up back at. If it's somebody else's pedigree, can this thing be accurate? Now, I'll tell you a secret. When you're doing these kind of searches and you want to find online stuff, the further back you go tends to be where you get the most stuff. The closer to the present, the less stuff. So when I go to look at this family, I don't start with John. I start over here with William, which makes no sense genealogically, but it does when you're trying to see whether there's a lot of stuff available. Because often, like if I'm in WikiTree and John Williams in there, Joseph will be in there, David will be in there, Schnabel will be in there, and we'll be able to follow this family down. And so that's kind of what I did. I went back to the furthest one and did a search on William Throwbridge and Elizabeth Lambert. And when it came up, I get my classic responses to my Google search. WikiTree, okay? It's the classic place you want to look online. Find a grave, another one that's worth looking at, even though you may have problems there. We Relate is another one of these sites where they do pedigrees of people and kind of back them up. It's not as good as the others for sources. And then Genie.com, which is another one of these WikiTree things that's online and has sources too. I think WikiTree's the best. Genie's probably the second best thing online, at least in my estimation. But these are the classic things to find. And so I'm going to go to each of those, and I'm going to do the old copy and paste of everything that they have on, in this case, who was it? William Thoroughbridge. And I'll do it also for the Lambertons. But we'll go after William first. And look, it had this beautiful biography on him, and it also had a nice little source collection on him. And it gave a link to the son that I go through, which I can't remember now. And so what it had here were good relationships, and often are not verified, but usually they're pretty accurate, I find, on this website. They get biographical data that I'm not going to find hardly anywhere else, which I love to read. And then the sources with hot links, which makes it wonderful. Okay, so here's the family going through WikiTree, and they had each of the children down to the father of John, and he's the guy that they peter out on and don't have anything on. The more recent people don't tend to fall into this tree as much as the people further back. So I'm able to verify the family going on back, though, very well with this, and have all kinds of good information. So I do my little copy and paste and start pulling. And I did for John, what I did for John is I went to Family Search and did a copy and paste of his sources. So I have that will, I have a transcription of the will, I found a marriage record transcription, census transcriptions. So I built my own little record of John using the sources that were there. And then continued on with all the rest of the guys. Whoops, what's going on? Everything wants to go forward, that's crazy. Okay, I built everything up and created a document. And it's called Thoroughbridge Online Resources. And I put it in my folder and I've added to it. I've got a book on the Thoroughbridge family. See, there's where you can download the whole book at Family Search. One fell swoop, I got the whole family book that was printed back before 1927 anyway. I found an article in the Register. I found an article in the Tag magazine. And I found another chapter out of another book. Copied all those things and put them in there. I have my own collection now on the Thoroughbridge family. I have my own little library without having to go to the library anymore. Okay? Now another one, Thankful Marsh. Now there's a name for you. There can't be many Thankful Marshes. And that's what went through my grandmother's mind. And my grandmother thought there was probably only one. And she found this Thankful Marsh in Massachusetts, born in 1757. And we know that James Barney marries a Thankful Marsh. Well, here's this Thankful Marsh in the same part of Pennsylvania, or Massachusetts, same part of Massachusetts as James Barney. So that's got to be the gal he married, right? Well, that's what they hooked up, and I have all these cool relatives. I've got some French Batoons, and I've got some Welsh Lewises, big cool relatives. I had these people for 100 years until I decided to verify things. That's when it all fell apart, because I find the birth record for that Thankful Marsh, born in Hampshire County, Massachusetts. The only trouble is I also find a marriage for her. Whoops, there it goes again. I find a marriage record for her in that same town, same county, to a different guy, not to my Barney. So that Thankful Marsh didn't marry my Barney, so what really was going on? Okay, so the Barneys that compiled this pedigree, they knew the wife's name, so that was okay, apparently. But the rest of the people put together the fact that there was this Thankful that lived in the same proximity as the Barneys, so that had to be the right gal. And in the early days, that's all you could do. And when you have a weird name like Thankful Barney, you almost have to think it's got to be her. Okay, so if this isn't her, what are we going to do? Well, The Barneys move to Vermont. John ends up in Vermont. This is where he and Thankful have children. Well, it just happens to be that there was a Marsh family down in Connecticut, of all places, who left Connecticut, went up the Connecticut River, and guess what's up the river? Vermont. They went up into Vermont, moved to Vermont, and settled in the same area that the Barneys settled. And that's where the Barneys married. They don't have a marriage record, but we have birth records on all the children, naming the parents, and it's okay. And it fits together. I actually found a third Thankful. There were 3 Thankful Marshes. The third one's about 30 years younger, so she's not it. But these 2 other gals were born within a year of each other. One in Connecticut, one in Massachusetts. So easy to see why they messed up on that. So now I have a whole different pedigree, and of course now I have to go and verify all these people, because, you know, this Thankful comes with a pedigree, we got to straighten it out. The funny thing is, if you go back on that Marsh line, you end up in the other Marsh line. They're all relatives. They're all cousins, so no matter which one you got, you end up back at the same Marsh in the end, which is kind of funny. Okay, almost done. Robert Pogue, who did he marry? This is over on my dad's side of the family, a little bit different. There was a book put together in 1954, and the guy that wrote the book was insistent that Robert Pogue married Elizabeth Preston. He went so far as to put a stone up for Robert Pogue, who died back in 1760, put a stone up saying he was married to Elizabeth Preston, and now people source that as the source for who he married. You know, it's like one of those self-perpetuating situations. Does it meet the standard of time? A lot of people want to believe it, okay? They want to say that Robert Pogue and Elizabeth Preston married in Ireland or maybe England and had a bunch of children, came to the New World, came first to Pennsylvania and then down into Virginia, which is very typical. He shows up for sure, 1739, 1740 in Augusta, because to get land you had to go in front of the judge and swear that you were there and you were self-supporting and you were going to support the government, and then they would give you land. And so we did that in 1740, and they're saying because all these kids were listed there, they must have been born in England or Ireland or somewhere else, when in fact the only thing that tells us is that the father came from out of the country and had to swear his allegiance and prove that he was self-sufficient. That's the only sources they really have on this family. And then I did my research and started doing the same kind of thing, digging around. I think I found that in Rootsweb, I found a lady who did extensive research and found that the folks came into Philadelphia and stayed in Pennsylvania for about 20 years. And in fact, Robert Pogue marries Elizabeth Rennick in 1724. They joined the church there in Abington, Pennsylvania. And in June of 1724, they joined the church. In March of 1728, his father-in-law and then his family and this guy and his wife were excommunicated for not attending church. So it names the fact that George Rennick and his son-in-law, Robert Pogue, as they called him in Pennsylvania, Pogue, you know, spelling, especially in those days, didn't really matter too much. They go together, we know that. They obviously stayed up there about 12 years and then come down to Virginia. He swears and gets his land in 1740. And then the thing that really caps it off is that in 1750, in that same county in Virginia, his father-in-law dies, and he's named as the executor, being the closest relative. There's no question who his wife is. She's a Rennick. And I get the rest of these people that want to do Preston to believe this. Heck no. We've had to settle on, you know, saying we'll go wherever it goes over on Family Search because neither side wants to give. So he now has 2 sets of wives. And you can pick the one you want to put as the preferred wife, because nobody will agree. So, I mean, these are the kind of things you run into when you start digging around in your tree. Okay, so again, just to review, favorite thing to do is Google. Learn to Google. That gets you the door opened on so many things. The wiki tree is great. It has about 30 million people in the tree. So it's not a lot, but the ones they have are well researched. And they're tending to be back a little further in time. Genie tree has 166 million, but because it's got so much, the extent of research is not as good. We relate probably the least good of the 3, but you never know. If it's the one that has that piece of information you need, then it becomes the best site out there. I love the register. You do have to be careful. The articles before 1900 have often been proven to be false. Even though they were well documented, the people didn't have a lot of sources. I love TAG, the American Genealogist. It started around 1950, and I find it to be great because they do a lot of articles that follow up on articles from the register that got it wrong, and they correct it. And so you go to the TAG and you find the corrections to the register, and you find out what really went on. I love the Great Migration books. If your family's early New England, the New England Historic and Genealogical Society has great books. Find a Grave, we talked about that, and any place else you can find. But the thing is, do dig around, and you will be surprised what you can find out there on virtually any family. It's hard not to find something on your family. Okay, questions? My voice is about dead anyway, and time's about up. Questions? Yeah.
I'm studying the Beeson family, which is an internal line for me. Can you hear me?
Barely.
I'm studying the Beeson line, which is an internal line for me. And I have 3 printed family histories. One of 1925 and another's 1968, and another's 1998. They all say something different. And then, well, they have basically the same children, but they have them in different orders. And I go on Ancestry, and it's the same mess. In fact, they have some children I've never heard of before.
Yeah, that's the trouble with ancestry trees.
Yeah, so I'm ready just to erase that man like he didn't exist. Because, I mean, he's making my tree very inaccurate, I feel.
Use this system and try looking him up and see what you can find, especially at WikiTree and Jenny.com, and you may find the answer to what really goes on here. Because that's what these people are trying to do. They're trying to unmask all the mistakes that are out there. So try that out before you decide do that extreme measure of just wiping them out.
Excommunicating them from the family.
But seriously, that's what I would do. And see if that brings clarity. Do the search on Google, and then look for those sites that I was showing you here that you can get if you do the QR code. And here's the handout. You pass this out. You know how to use a QR code? Take your smartphone, just point it at this, and it's going to bring up a little line that says, this is what that is. You touch it, and it'll open up that page, that PDF document.
Yeah, use your camera.
And then just download it. Print it out, download it, do whatever you want with it.
We'll share.
Okay. Guess that's one piece of paper.
And then we can share.
Yeah.
Can you have that? Can you have that?
You want one? Yeah, it worked out perfect. Last one, and you did it. Okay, but that's what I would do, seriously. Hey, you might be surprised. These guys, these sites that I'm talking about today bring clarity to confusion a lot of times. They're not always accurate, sometimes they're pushing their own philosophy, but 99% of the time, you will get a straight scoop from one of the sites. Some will be better than others. Any other questions? I appreciate your time. We had a great adventure tonight, but it worked.
I
So,
don't know that we want you back, but I don't know how much more adventure we can take.
Hey,
Thank
I'm
you,
happy
Mr.
to
Gibbons.
sit down.